in June 1927 when both were 21 years old. It was through the Finnish Apostolic Lutheran Church that Hugo Frederick Hillstrom, who was the oldest child of Joseph Frederick Hillstrom and Ina Eskelin, met Lempi Sophie Gavasari Anderson, the second youngest child of John Gavasari Anderson and Mary or Marie Hill. He was born in Sabika, Minnesota, a Finnish community, in 1905, 6 years after his parents had arrived in America. She was born in Maringa, Wisconsin, another Finnish community, in 1906, many years after her parents had settled there. Minneapolis was a natural crossroad for many of these Finnish towns. A large cosmopolitan center with its own active church group. We think they met there. On their marriage license, on which Hillstrom is misspelled, both parents' names have already been anglicized. And his occupation is listed as carpenter. Hers is at home. They were married in Salo, Michigan, his parents' home by Reverend Sam Kovala, her parents' minister. The earliest photo of him that we have shows him with two classmates at the age of 14 in 1929, a serious, handsome lad in a belted jacket. Here he is a year later in the same studio, the same thoughtful stance, if a bit more relaxed. The two photographs together giving us a glimpse of his emerging personality. Years later, he wrote about these years. During the flu epidemic of 1919, I contracted the flu, which developed into pneumonia and then a chronic infection of the lungs lasting a number of years. This, plus a number of other factors, prevented me from going back to school. But he pointedly added that he continued his education through 16 years of correspondence courses and constant research thereafter. The earliest photo we have of Lempi is the one with her sister Emma. My guess is that she was also in her teens. Here she is again, a sensitive face, clear-eyed and innocent, but the story of her education is very different. She was proud of the fact that she was the first in her family to graduate from high school, and her sisters who surround her here were just as proud as she was. Not just any high school, a small town school, but from North High in Minneapolis. And when I became the first in my family to graduate from college and the first later to get my PhD, she reminded me of her achievement, how pleased she was that I was continuing her tradition of firsts. Our challenge in this chronicle is to understand what happened to change these shy newlyweds with the bloom of the country still on them into the alert, affluent, sophisticated, sparkling 50-year-olds who gaze so confidently out at us 30 years later. In other words, how did the carpenter, ready to follow in his father's footsteps, become instead the CEO of a major American industry? How did the country girl with her favorite newborn calf, or cradling her favorite chicken in the chicken yard, how did she become the glamorous matron in furs? What happened to transform Hugo and Lempi into Hugo and Goldie, seen here looking like fashion plates while they were on cruise aboard Her Majesty's ship, the Queen Elizabeth? America happened. The American dream happened. Our parents' story is really the story of the Americanization of Hugo and Goldie, the making of a self-made man with the loyal and talented and resourceful support of his wife, not through simple assimilation, rejection of roots, and entrance into the mainstream, but rather by tracing in the course of their lives a pattern far more complex and far more interesting than charts like this like to suggest. In this chronicle, we will follow a path from their Pesapeike, That's Finnish for ethnic nest. From Hancock and Marengo to Spooner, Wisconsin during the New Deal years, then to Buffalo, New York, when Dad started at the bottom in private industry, then to New Prague, Minnesota, when he became mill manager in a small town, then Detroit, Michigan, to manage a much larger mill in a major city and live in an opulent suburb. But then, rather than continuing that rise up the ladder, deciding on a new American dream and choosing for their locale not just any small town, but one of the oldest Finnish communities in America, in Kokado. Thus they returned to roots on the one hand, while on the other hand Dad became credentialed in the most advanced forms of agricultural engineering in his profession. And he became obsessed by the desire to do research, first in Kokado and then Monticello. I think it's a wonderful story. It's a gripping story, and I feel privileged to tell it. It's fun to speculate when in the saga of Americanization these different photos were taken. Is this on their honeymoon? And don't they look wonderful here, handsome, already groomed for success? The car in this one dates this as the late 30s or after. Posing a handsome woman by a new car was a very American habit by then. But in strict apostolic Lutheran families, women didn't wear makeup or permanent their hair, and Mother was criticized for her first permanent. Any adornments, even window curtains, were forbidden. And so were alcohol, card playing, radio, later television. I remember having to hide the cards when company from Marengo was coming. But I also remember that around 1940, especially after their sightseeing trip to New York City, this is Mother at the top of the Empire State Building, and here they both are at Grant's tomb. These were regular stops on sightseeing tours then. Or after they became socialized into American middle-class ways, I remember they told us not to hide the cards or take off our lipsticks. Their family would have to accept them the way they were here on the town with Wes and Madeline. And what I'm saying is that you can trace a very interesting pattern of evolution as we track out Hugo's career path and follow Hugo and Goldie's story through 10 different places they lived. Before he was married, during the 1920s, Hugo had traveled from town to town with his father seeking work in carpentry, sometimes as far from Salo as Milwaukee or Chicago. They lived in boarding houses in these towns. For a time in Iron Mountain, that was where Dad first put out his own business cards, as well as advertising their specialties in carpentry. One of Dad's adventures in those days was being jailed for allegedly misrepresenting himself as an employment agent of the Ford Motor Company. When I saw this hand-printed caption in his scrapbook years ago, I said, "Yes, tell me the story." And he told me how, as an eager young man trying to establish himself, he had been framed by Harry Bennett's goons. Now, Harry Bennett was the infamous strong-arm hired by Henry Ford, who didn't want anybody horning in on his control over hiring at Ford plants in northern Michigan. Dad had been helping Finnish immigrants who couldn't write English fill out application forms so they could get work, and to thank him, they'd give him a quarter or $1. The only $25 ever given him was from the men who framed him. But what I find interesting in this write-up is how the inflated prose gives away the paper's bias. Bennett was known to control local newspapers. For instance, not until the end, the final paragraph, do they admit that the charges were dropped, or as they put it, prosecution is not being pressed in this case. I really admire Dad for saving these clippings. Later in life, he made a witty comment on this sort of dishonest journalism when the Cokato Enterprise published a front-page article accusing him of trying to burn down the snowdrifts around his home in Chickenville, saying he'd have to spend 10 days in the coop, and quoting his comment, "It makes me broil." But notice the date, April Fool's Day. After the wedding, Hugo and Goldie left for Chicago, then billed as the metropolis of the West, where she got a job at Marshall Fields, at least until she got pregnant, and he continued in carpentry. But in Chicago in 1927, that meant joining the Union, and he later cited this Union card as proof that he understood what it was like to be a Union man. Then came the Great Depression, when so many in America were suddenly plunged into poverty, joblessness, and hopelessness, and Hugo and Goldie returned to their ethnic homes, first to be near his parents in Hancock, where he found work in a lumber camp, dutifully recording for us in a scrapbook with a certain pride all the steps and stages in logging and how he had personally experienced each one of them until his rheumatism made it impossible for him to continue. After a year, there was not enough money coming in, and Hugo's rheumatism was getting worse, so they moved to Marengo to be with her parents, to get their own place after helping with farming at the Andersons, and there becoming a part of Marengo culture. It was a time when, for many Americans, poverty was a fact of life. Those of us children at the top of the alphabet knew about growing up poor, but our parents made sure we didn't feel poor. In fact, one of my favorite stories is the one about how they were down to their last quarter and spent it on a Charlie Chaplin movie and ice cream cones. Or was it Fred Astaire and Ginger? A quarter went far in those days. The first major turning point in their lives came when they were living in Marengo and Hugo was discovered by government administrators. This time was also a time when idealistic New Dealers were setting out to reinvent the country by putting the discouraged to work in the CCC, the WPA, the PWA. Two such administrators came to Marengo, saw the Brunswillow School Hugo had built, asked who designed it. When they learned it was him, urged him to apply for a civil service job, which he did, and he was chosen for the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, to head up projects in 2 Wisconsin counties. At first, that meant working out of Ashland, near Marengo. In his scrapbook, he kept track of completed WPA projects that he had been a part of. Schoolhouses, especially Minong School, seen here. Dams built under his direction. And homes for Danbury Indians. As his notes revealed, it was an amazing story of speed and quality in building, which the local papers acknowledged with a good deal of awe and congratulations. From his scrapbook clippings, we also learned how often he was hospitalized. He would be several times in his life, often leaving behind a poem thanking the nurses. As late as his hospitalization in Monticello, late in life, we discover he recycled a tribute he had first written during those Marengo days. Then, since he had succeeded so well at his work, when the WPA was reorganized, he was promoted to be the administrator of 7 counties. And what this meant was moving the family to a place which billed itself as the heart of the Indian Head country, the town called Spooner, Wisconsin. Now, Spooner was not in itself that far from Marengo in miles, but oh my, it was a whole world away from the ethnic context in which the family had been living in up to then. It wasn't hard to understand why our parents had become supporters of Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the 1930s. So were most Americans in those days. But our parents were such fans they had named a son Delano after him even before Dad had started working for the WPA. After 1936, especially after Spooner, they had personal reasons to be proud. And they were eager to answer Republican critics. My favorite example is a poem refuting Republicans' charges that WPA workers were lazy types who spent their time leaning on shovels. You have no doubt all heard about that WPA man, that American individual whom some would like to can. He takes the brunt of so many jokes of wrath and of damnation that he seems to be the most talked about poor worker in the nation. Who is this man they talk about who seems to be so funny? Who never does a thing all day but waste the public's money? Such a man, let's meet him once, we'll go and get acquainted. We want to see if the story really is as it's been painted. We found him working on the roads, on buildings, and in trenches. The office man was at his desk, the craftsmen at their benches. We found wide streets and highways, large buildings true and level. We asked him how he did it. He said, leaning on a shovel. We took the hint and left him, and as we thus dispersed, forgave him for his satire, as the joke was sure reversed. We don't know how he does it, but he must work like the devil to do the very things he does while leaning on a shovel. Hugo's most ambitious architectural design was this one, Spooner City Hall, a very 1930s building, streamlined, modern, was the style of the day, and he was rightfully proud of his achievement. Spooner was where this photograph of the children was taken. Einie, Betty, Clara May, Delano, Ellen, Floyd, and baby Grace. Mother had given birth 7 times within 11 years. Even the chair in the photograph is classic 1930s style. And it was in the Spooner schools that this bunch discovered an America that was not made up solely of Finnish Americans or Apostolic Lutherans. One of the 2 houses in Spooner we lived was called the Yellow House, except Grace discovered it's now painted brown. By now, the automobile was becoming an important part of American life. It made it possible for relatives to come and visit us, and increasingly it was necessary for Hugo's job as his territory expanded. It also made possible our weekend outings to Spooner Lake, where the folks had bought some property so the family could go fishing and boating. This was our favorite destination for a weekend drive in those days, until they had to put the property up for sale. The PA was abolished, Hugo was out of work, and the family once again faced poverty. I think that was good for us because it made us flexible in our ability to face whatever life handed us thereafter. Dad had achieved a civil service rating of a civil engineer, assistant civil engineer, and he was able to bring that to private industry where he was hired as a trainee, starting out at the bottom for the International Milling Company, the nation's 3rd largest flour milling company. And that's where the story was born that they had put a broom in his hand and he was insulted after the rank he had achieved in the WPA, but he decided he would make that floor as clean as any floor he could find, And he did, and he was subsequently promoted. We children have strong memories of the trip from Spooner to Buffalo, the car games we played, the house without a bathroom we lived in. We had to share it with another family that lived up front. But all we have as mementos are one picture of Ine with her dog, some report cards, and the new thatch. The new thatch was a ceramic nuthatch, which was all Cal and I could afford for a gift for Daddy's birthday, and he jokingly called it the new thatch. And to this day, it is for Cal and me our strongest memory of that one transitional year.
In 1944, Hugo was promoted to engineer in charge of plant modernization, and in 1945 came a really big break when we moved to the small town of New Prague, Minnesota, because Hugo was made plant manager of the company's oldest plant. We lived there only 3 years, but in that time we saw our status as a family dramatically change. Suddenly our father was the leading citizen of the town. It was a mill town after all, and he was a mill manager. He became president of the Rotary Club, Cub Master, Boy Scout leader. He raised money for school band uniforms. In short, he began to engage in the civic activity expected of America's new management class. Now, back in Marengo, he had played horseshoes and had won himself some local renown as an ace bowler with the WPA team. In fact, the newspapers in those days called him the Marengo sharpshooter, high man for both teams, also known as the Marengo Flash. But now, with New Prague having a golf course the town was really proud of, signaling his rise in class, Hugo took up golf. Hereafter, he would also vote Republican. I must say I loved the house that we lived in, with its octagonal windows and a garden in the back. This was where we lived out the war years, World War II, when cousin Phil Kivy was our war hero, a flyer who became my personal favorite pen pal. And this is where we learned to eat and live by carefully counting out ration stamps. This was where Cal and I graduated from this fairly conservative small-town high school, which nonetheless had put Franz Marc's blue horses on the landing of its stairwell. This was our first exposure to modern art. And this was where Irene, the last of the 9, was born, and where on Thanksgiving Day 1948, the first photograph with all 9 of us around the Thanksgiving table was taken. But Dad's rise up the ladder had not ended. In 1948, the New Prague Times announced the news he had been promoted to manage a much larger mill in a much larger town. A city, in fact, where we had to get used to looking up at buildings and moving to a faster, more sophisticated pace. Quite a change from the small towns. We moved to an elegant house at 2022 Northwood Boulevard in the then Tony suburb of Royal Oak. Ine had married by then. Cal and I entered Wayne University in Detroit. Delano and Ellen went to Royal Oak High. The house was located behind the famous Shrine of the Little Flower, where the controversial Father Coughlin still preached. The house was clearly high suburban, and as an act of loyalty to the company which had made our father such a respected big shot in the big city, we all joined in learning to sing the advertising ditty, Robin Hood flower, the all-purpose flower, Robin Hood flower, that being the product International was known for. The mill was on the waterfront of this city, where Dad again became active in Rotary, again became a civic leader. For 3 years, he seemed very much the man at the top of the heap, living proof of the American dream, the quintessential self-made man. What we didn't know until later was the toll that the pressures of so responsible a job was taking on his health and stability. He bragged about the family band for the chatty columns of Detroit papers. One columnist gushed over how much playing with the band Relax, Dad, the big tycoon, after a hard day at the office. And it was true, we had fun together, but the truth was also that Cal and I could return to college after a weekend of playing together, while Delano, who was then entering his difficult teens, became the lightning rod for our father's wrath each evening when he returned home from downtown.
Years later, the newspapers would say he left international milling for reasons of health, but he told his family while sitting around the dining room table, as he so often did, sounding off, that what he really meant was his emotional health. He was getting much too tense. But by 1951, in any case, he and Mother had a new dream, a dream that led to the biggest turning point in their entire lives.
The new dream revolved around chickens. Lots and lots of chickens. 60,000 broilers, I think it was, housed on the second floor of a broiler house Hugo designed, making use of the air physics he had learned in the flour milling business. On the first floor, he housed steer, recycling chicken manure mixed with grain, using the very latest in modern equipment to run the whole operation. Had he converted from businessman to farmer? Not really. His dream was born of his eagerness to work on a project all his own that drew on his talents as engineer, architect, physicist, chemist, manager, and veterinarian. As locale for the project, he and Mother went back to the small town, but they chose a Finnish-American town, Kokado, with a Finnish apostolic church north of town, so ethnic that the sermons and hymns were still sung in Finnish, and where Oscar and Ina Kivi, Goldie's sister, lived. But note the difference by now. There was an old house on the property for the family to live in while they were building their dream house. Dad's hope was to get closer to his children, especially his sons, by working with them side by side to build both the house on the hill and the broiler plant with its signature silos behind it. By 1952, the year of their 25th wedding anniversary, Hugo and Goldie had achieved their new dream. The house had a prairie-style roof of the kind inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright, a lawn so big Dad needed a tractor to mow it, a charming lawn swing on the side of the house. Here's Mother on the swing. And out back, a patio with a picnic table and barbecue, with a rock garden for Mother's flowers, and she did love flowers. We all came home that summer to celebrate the anniversary, the girls and Mother posing together. Mother loved being one of the girls in our usual way. The three brothers together, that's Inie's son Ricky on Delano's car. I remember how much at ease they seemed in their new space and how at ease they were with us on that warm June day. All of us waving to the cars that honked as they drove by. The whole town seemed to know what was going on with the Hillstroms on the hill north of town. The second photo of the family around the table was taken that day. A handsome, prosperous lot, I think, the epitome of post-war 1950s affluence, most of us having flown or driven in just for this occasion. Over the years that followed, friends and relatives would come to visit. Snapshots would be taken on the front stoop of children and grandchildren, as more and more grandchildren tended to show up over the years. This portrait of Dad in 1962 is particularly fine, caught in a casual moment. Here's Mother at her oven baking her bread. Christmas mornings in the living room, usual mess. And while the market for chickens fluctuated over the years, making their economic future constantly uncertain, nothing could stop Hugo from dreaming up schemes, one of which was the sheep chick, a small chicken similar to a Cornish game hen, which he succeeded in marketing for a season in major restaurants, even placing frozen packages he himself had designed into the local markets where his children could find and buy them. Now they were getting written up in Minneapolis papers. Now Dad was working with professors from the Agricultural School of the University of Minnesota on his research, while Mother's talents as a cook, which were always considerable, were also incorporated into the project. Inside the house, they had installed a tile sauna early on, complete with Finnish proverbs translated on the walls. Later, they put in a pioneer room with a spinning wheel and a butter churn and an honest-to-goodness working loom in it. That's Einie sitting behind it. It was a kind of personal museum. One wondered what need for roots had inspired it. A room with rugged beamed ceiling with real log walls, recalling the log cabins the Finns had brought to America so long ago. Year by year, the scope of Hugo's research expanded beyond animal waste and feed mixtures to include soil conservation and later heating systems for agricultural buildings. His reputation grew until he was recognized around the world for his work. "Research is my life's blood," he was often quoted as saying. He attended conventions and delivered papers, one in Chicago's Palmer House in 1961 on ionization in controlled animal environments. And 14 years later, in Atlanta, he was speaking on recycling animal wastes, the subject on which he was recognized throughout the world by then as the leading expert. And now they became world travelers. Hugo's success and growing expertise made it possible for them to travel abroad, more than any members of their families before, eventually around the world. During the 60s, they took a cruise aboard the RMS Queen Elizabeth, the usual sort of cruise with relaxing on deck chairs and wearing party hats. But they enjoyed even more their trips combining business with pleasure. They traveled to Sydney, Australia, for example, where Dad supervised the building of a 1,000-head beef feedlot recycling operation that he had designed. Now that's a lot of bull, he said, of this image, a slide. And while they were in Australia, the land of kangaroos, they took in the sights from down under. They also took in Hong Kong and Singapore on that trip and went to Japan, where Hugo personally supervised the construction of a recycling complex he had designed. Then a long excursion in Europe was a high point in their travels. This is a photograph of Dad's map. They stopped in Paris. They took in Versailles. They then rode on a camel and saw the pyramids on their way to Israel, where Hugo tested his recycling theories on a complete ecocycle. But being in Israel, he used goats rather than hogs for one part of the cycle. While they were in the region, they visited the Holy Land, which is important to them, including Lake Galilee and Nazareth. They then went on to take in Italy and Italy and Switzerland and Berlin, and then headed north to Scandinavia and the Soviet Union. Stockholm was more than sightseeing, since he also consulted there with researchers about their recycling needs. And then we know that they stopped in Moscow. And from Moscow and Leningrad, Hugo sent back letters to Kokado newspapers reporting on their travel impressions. It was from this article that I learned of their passionate pilgrimage to go to northern Finland to discover their roots. And we know now how they did discover the very houses from which both sets of parents had left for America, and finally saw the land of the midnight sun from which their ancestors had come. Oh, this is a funny series of pose snapshots. Dad for a season grew a beard and posed in a collection of hats from the different places they had visited. He does look a bit stiff, but Dad was never very good at acting. But the images do give us a side of their trips and their travels. Meanwhile, as the years went by one, we children had left home, Irene staying for the longest time, Grandma and Grandpa coming to live with them until 1968. When there were only the two of them, Hugo and Goldie, something had begun happening to her. Some years earlier, she had begun to experience unexpected, devastating bouts of depression. Conscientiously, she recorded in her scrapbook that she was hospitalized 3 times at Golden Valley Hospital and given electroconvulsive therapy to cure the depression. The treatments did help, she said, but they also caused her to lose some of her memory. Over and over after that, we saw how she rallied, and we would see again that perky, mischievous mother we had known all our lives who loved to be silly with the girls. We would see again her loyalty to him, as all our lives, in Cal's words, we had heard her brag about him to anybody who would listen. Then, in 1971, Hugo and Goldie put the destiny of the Hillstrom Research Farm into the capable hands of their son-in-law and daughter, and started over once more, moving to Monticello, Minnesota, not far from Cokato, where they bought this absolutely stunning new house. It was surrounded by nature. It was even more Frank Lloyd Wright than their Cokato house had been. It had a paneled office they enjoyed. It had beautiful balconies for looking out on nature. And one of the sources of the Mississippi River rose as a stream in their own backyard. The town paper called it the automated house. Once Dad started adding gadgets to it, and Dad did love gadgets. He had put a phone in the sauna, and the Monticello Times thought that was newsworthy, as well as the fact that their home office had his and hers desks. His pride and joy was now an organ synthesizer that he could play for hours on end. They created a new company, Hllstrom Associates, so he could devote his attention to research. Then, under Electro Industries, he consolidated research activities of Power Electric and other enterprises. He supervised construction on new buildings, as he'd once done for the WPA. He designed heating units suited to agricultural life. By then, he had won the respect of a new set of colleagues and had long since become a member of the American Association of Agricultural Engineers, a source of pride and validation to a man whose formal education had ended at 14. And oh yes, they were still voting for Nixon. Again, Hugo became president of Rotary, for which he was given a special plaque for being president 3 times in his career. Again, his research activities, his achievements, were described with awe in the Monticello Times. When he learned in 1974 that he had leukemia, he did not pause in his work. He did not slacken his pace. If anything, I think he quickened it, as if eager to get all the work done. He did play a bit more on his organ and romp with us when we came to visit. I love this photo. In 1975, he helped to arrange that timely family reunion of his brothers and sisters in Detroit. This seems a good time, as we lead up to the story of their final days, to invite Ken Hillstrom, Dad's youngest brother, to share his impressions of Hugo and Goldie, first of her, then of him, as we review snapshots of their lives.
I never came to know Goldie well, as in sharing a heart-to-heart about anything. I did classify her early on as a quiet sweetie. From the start and ever afterwards, she never once spoke to me in any way other than kindly, even lovingly. Perhaps I never gave her occasion to be cross with me, but also I never saw her speak to anybody angrily or rudely. And I'm sure someone must have given her occasion, starting with my strong-willed brother and their strong-willed offspring. But nope, so to me a sweetie.
Ken then went on to the somewhat more difficult task of assessing his brother.
Cordial, I guess, summarizes our relationship for many years. He had his reservations about me, as just mentioned, and I had mine about him. But I always had high regard for his accomplishments, including engendering quite a remarkable family. I just never have related well with dominant types, maybe because I secretly want to be one myself, and Hugo did hold forth sometimes. Many of his discourses were interesting, though, or informative. Later, he considerably mellowed into what I saw as a much more humane person. I also began to get the feeling he regarded me as something more than a sort of drifter who read a lot. Also that he liked me for what I was, whatever that was. And that's where a basic aspect of Hugo will ever remain in my memory. One heck of a man, and a good man.
I share Ken's assessment. All of his children probably had some reservations about Hugo. I quarreled with my father all my life, especially in the later years. Conversations between us often became tense when he began to hold forth, as Ken says. But I never doubted or ceased to respect his accomplishments. Think about it. Through his work with animal wastes, through his experiments with ecocycles, he had proved that a complete ecocycle could be, and one day would be, completed. And in doing so, he had pushed forward research in food production. He had pushed back the frontiers of waste. He has pushed back the frontiers of hunger in the world. And he had made the earth a more ecologically safe place. Surely this was no small achievement, and he could not have done it without Mother at his side every step of the way. We come now to the part of Hugo and Goldie's story that is the hardest to tell.
In November 1975, the Monticello Times reported an honorary membership in Rotary, which Hugo called the highest honor I've ever been given, and added that although he and his wife were going to Florida, we'll be back. You can be sure of that. Monticello is both home and business to us. Mother celebrated her 70th birthday in January, and on 4th of July, back in Monticello, they showed the colors one more time and got gussied up for the bicentennial. They had already begun work on another new house in Monticello, a house to which they fully intended to return after spending a few months in Florida. Then they took a sentimental journey to northern Michigan to visit sites of their youth, Iron Mountain, Hancock, Salo. They saw the house where Mother had given birth in the middle of a snowstorm, ate pasties, visited cemeteries for what they must have known would be the last time. Then they left again for Florida, for Englewood, and with the help of Ellen and Carmi, they built themselves yet another home. Here it is. It came complete with a pet heron that would walk in and visit them from time to time. The following January, the Monticello Times published the news on its front page. Hugo had not made it back after all. He had suffered a stroke while taking a sauna, where he had gone every morning for relief from pain, and had died soon afterward. All of his children, some of his grandchildren, and all his living relatives showed up in that little Florida town for the occasion of his funeral. The sheer number of photographs that we took on that occasion must have given us a premonition that this would be the last time so many Hillstroms would be gathered together in a single place. We mourned, but we also had good laughing times and good talking times on that day, all taking back our separate memories. Daddy died in January of the year that would have been in June, Hugo and Goldie's 50th wedding anniversary. So together we children schemed to make it Goldie's Golden Day, held at Ellen's with everything in gold, including her pantsuit, a sunburst clock, even the wreath she laid on her husband's grave. A tree was planted in her honor. There was a cake, of course, and from children and grandchildren there were gifts of songs and poems, one with lines that spoke for us all. We, the children of her smile, are content to bask in the rays which reach to hold us all equally. Cartwheels in the light of her love, we are at peace. Her light shines on as sunsets, mixing, sliding pinks and lavenders. She stays a ray of gold, never fading, never old, on this, her forever golden day. For a few years more, Mother was her smiling self, pronouncing herself positively manic when she came to our son's high school graduation in Sacramento.
Stop.
But this is not a story with a happy ending. Mother lived on for another 10 years after Daddy died, at Iney's in Cokato in a separate apartment, then with Floyd and Sandy, then in Bradenton, Florida, where under Cal's care she lived in a nursing home for a time and where we would come to visit with her. And finally, with Ellen and John Schmay in Venice, Florida for her last years, where she needed constant daily care, which was lovingly given. During celebrations, during these last 10 years, she tried to summon smiles for her children's sake. They were trying so hard to cheer her. And it was precious beyond words when she could muster a smile, especially this one on her 80th birthday. But often the photographs also revealed all too clearly what she was feeling inside. We might be smiling to beat the band. Hadn't we learned from her to do exactly that? But she wasn't smiling with us now. She was no longer one of the girls. It was sad, sad beyond words to know she was so sad, so unable with her memory gone to celebrate with us our milestones and our history. So deep in depression at times, it seemed as if nothing could reach her, wanting only, she said, to be with her Hugo in heaven. She died in Venice, Florida on March 23, 1987. She was buried in Englewood beside her beloved Hugo. When in their marriage it became their song, I don't know. But Let Me Call You Sweetheart was perfect for them, sentimental the way they were sentimental with each other. After his brilliant career, after her success in raising all those children, there was still the astonishing fact that they remained sentimental sweethearts to the ends of their lives. In the time they were together, they had furnished 14 houses in 11 towns or cities in 5 different states. In 1970, Dad had summed up a lifetime saying, "I have been a lucky man. I have done well in business and I have a good family and a nice home. It shows you anything is possible in this country." But it wasn't just luck. For Hugo and Goldie, anything was possible because they believed in this country, in America's promise, in the freedom to live their lives their own way, to adventure, to experiment, to follow their dreams. That belief in individual freedom would become even more apparent in their alphabetical children, who are the subject of my last chronicle.